Isn't that awesome to see all those kids go out there? Yeah. Nope. That's what I was saying. It's awesome to see them leave. Get them out of here. Mark chapter 3, we're going to continue our series today on following Jesus in the real world. And again, by that I mean, sometimes we look at the Bible and some people look at it as some archaic book that doesn't fight us today. But how would Jesus walk in our culture, and how does he expect us to walk in our culture today? What would it be like? And the last several weeks we've been talking about Jesus' baptism. It's where his ministry started. It's where our journey starts with Christ. And we talk about his temptation. We talk about his calling, just normal everyday people, and doing great things, extraordinary things with them. And today we're going to skip to actually all the way through chapter 2, going into chapter 3. I do want to make mention of chapter 2, verse 23. Go ahead and look there and follow along there, because there's this buildup that's happening going into chapter 3. And there's this tension that's happening between the religious rulers, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, and the scribes, and the Herodians. And there's this tension that's building and building just right off at the start of Jesus' ministry. And it's going to build all the way for 3.5 years through his ministry, and culminating at the cross. And this is how much they hated and reviled Jesus. And it just plays itself out here from the very beginning. And so, actually, in chapter 2, verse 18 through 22, we're not going to look at that, but the leaders there, they get on Jesus' disciples because they're not fasting. The Pharisees' disciples and John's disciples, they fasted. Jesus, why doesn't yours? And he, of course, gives them an answer. And then verse 23 says, in chapter 2, now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. If I say Sabbath, make sure you're awake and paying attention. The Sabbath, this is going to be the big deal here that's coming up. And they picked grain on the Sabbath. And as they went through, the disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that would be very strenuous and a lot of work. But they were picking the heads of grain off as they went through. And verse 24 says, and the Pharisees said to him, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? See, they considered that. They had taken the Sabbath and they had used it so much, they took it as far as to say this picking grains of the heads of the grain off is work. They shouldn't do that on the Sabbath. And they had this thing so blown out of proportion that you could do nothing on the Sabbath. And I use this as an illustration because it's kind of stuck out when we went to Israel. And I've told you this before, but on the Sabbath over in Israel, in some hotels, well, probably all hotels, they had a kosher elevator and a Gentile elevator. And the kosher, if you wanted, you could not, it was set to stop on every floor, because pushing the button would be considered what? And the Pharisees back in Jesus' day, they've taken it that far. They've taken it so far that you could do basically nothing on the Sabbath. So they're accusing Jesus' disciples of working on the Sabbath just by plucking that off as they were going through the grain fields and eating. Verse 25, Jesus says, but he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry? He and those with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priest. Now, even that situation was unlawful to do, but it says, and Jesus says, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So there's this tension there, and Jesus says to them, he kind of puts them in their place, and he says, look, the Sabbath was made for man. Man needed rest, so God created the Sabbath so he could rest. He didn't create he said he did not create man for the Sabbath. See, God didn't make the Sabbath and say, I want to create man and make him follow all these strenuous rules and, put this weight on him. That's not what he did. And so Jesus puts them in their place, if you will. Now, chapter 3, verse 1. And he entered the synagogue, that's Jesus, and he entered the synagogue again. And a man was there who had a withered hand. Let's stop. We're going to break this up as we go along. And so there's several things I want to draw out of this today and apply this to our lives today. One thing is this. If you're taking notes, write down that word again. It says, and he entered the synagogue again. Now we know through reading the New Testament, the Gospels, that Jesus had a habit of and a custom to go to Sabbath, to go to the synagogue, and to go there every Sabbath. He would go to worship God with the other Jews. He would go there, and it was a habit, it was his custom, just like going out to pray was his habit, his custom. You know, not all habits are bad. He had a habit of going to worship. I was talking to somebody the other day, we were talking about how, you probably heard this before too, you don't have to go to church to be a Christian. You've heard that? And that's a true statement. Right? You don't have to go to church to be a Christian. And going to church doesn't make you a Christian. You understand that, right? Just because you go to church doesn't make you a Christian. Just like going to a garage doesn't make you, or living in a garage doesn't make you a car, right? We've talked about that before. Now, you don't have to be a car, or you don't have to go to the gas station to be a car, right? So if you don't go to the gas station and you're a car, what's going to happen? You're going to run out of gas. It's the same way with believers. If you don't get together with the body of Christ, you're going to run out of gas. All right? You're going to run out of strength. You're going to run out of encouragement. That's why Hebrews 10 says, don't neglect meeting together, gathering together, and it can stir up good works and love. And Jesus had a habit of coming together and worship. Never get out of the habit of coming together and worshiping with other believers. And it says, and Jesus entered the synagogue again. And a man was there. Now some believe this man was planted by the Pharisees that are coming up. And we're going to talk about the next verse. He may have been, he may not have been. That's irrelevant. But I think he probably was. And that word withered, his withered hand means atrophy. It was all from lack of use. It was all drawn up. The book of Luke says that it was his right hand, so it very well could have been his prominent hand. And then whatever happened to him forced him to maybe have to use his other hand. You ever had to do that? Have a sore prominent hand and you have to use your other hand? Man. We had to deal with that somehow. But there was this man there. We don't know his name. But there was a man there. In verse 2, here's what happens. So they, Luke tells us, the scribes and the Pharisees are the they. So they watched him closely, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. So they watched him closely. There's others that went to worship at the Sabbath, at the synagogue that day. It was the scribes and the Pharisees. What were they doing there? They were worshiping God. Were they worshiping God? No. They were watching Jesus. And watching closely simply means that. Watching his every move. They didn't care what anybody else was doing. They watched him. They watched his every move. And he went there. We know he was teaching there from other passages in Luke. He was there and he taught. And they watched him closely. And what were they watching him for? To see if he'd mess up and sin somehow? No, look what it says. So they watched him closely whether he would heal on the Sabbath. God forbid he do something like heal somebody on the Sabbath. Isn't that horrible? Isn't that awful that Jesus would heal somebody? See, they missed it totally. They watched him to see if he would heal. The problem was, it was the Sabbath. See, if Jesus would have walked over to him and touched his hand and said, be healed, they would have said what? Because he touched his hand, it would be considered what? Work. Jesus. Aha, we got it. He's working on the Sabbath. That's how ridiculous it was. They were waiting. They watched him. If he just touched him, he's guilty of breaking the Sabbath. They got him. So they watched him closely. Do you realize that people are watching you as a believer? All the time. And I'm going to tell you something. You better not be one of these believers that is really self-righteous and put yourself out there like you're better than everybody else. Because you're the one they're really watching. Because the moment you mess up, I was talking about this with somebody else earlier. The moment you mess up, it doesn't matter how many things you've done good over the years, that one thing, they'll hold that against you for the rest of your life. Right? What I'm saying is this. Be real as a Christian. Be real. Be who you are. Let them know, I'm not perfect. I tell you that, guys, all the time, because as a pastor, a lot of times pastors are looked like, you got to be better than everybody, better be better than everybody. And I want you to know, I have fears like you do. I have concerns. I have dreams and hopes just like you do. I have people tell me all the time, I don't know if it's a good thing or not. But I have people that'll tell me after I meet with them for a little while, and we're talking and have a conversation, and they'll say, and you do what for a living? If I didn't know that, if you hadn't told me you were a pastor, I never would have guessed you were a pastor. Never. You just don't come across like a preacher. I'm like, thanks. I guess. I am what you see. That's it. And that's what I'm encouraging you to be, is put yourself out there as you're a Christ follower, just trying to follow Him. And we're all in the same boat. We're all at the foot of the cross, the same place, the same level. And we're striving to go to the same place, get to the same place through the blood of Christ. And they watched Him to see if He would heal on the Sabbath so that they might accuse Him. In verse 3, and He said to them, or He said to the man. Now I want you to know something. Again, Luke 6:8 says that Jesus knew their thoughts at this point. He knew what they were thinking. He knew they were planning on finding something wrong with Him. He knew that. Waiting for Him. I feel sorry for this guy, don't you? Even if he was a plant or not. Can you imagine? They're waiting. They don't feel sorry for the guy. There's nothing like that. No compassion. They're just waiting. Oh, I hope that Jesus touches him. Oh, I hope. So we can catch Jesus. Forget this guy who's got a withered hand and he can't use it. Jesus knows their thoughts. And what's He do? Look at verse 3. And He said to the man who had the withered hand, step forward. I love Jesus. He's so awesome. He knows their thoughts. He knows what they want. And He calls the man. He looks at him and says, let's just get this out here. Let's just get this out here. Come here. Stand right in the middle of everybody. Sit right here so everybody can see. Okay? Stand right here because I want them to see this. And I'm sure the Pharisees and the scribes are like, yes, touch it, Jesus. That's all you got to do. Just touch it. We got it. Then Jesus says in verse 4, then He said to them, He asked them a question. Is it lawful? And these guys should have known the answer. They do know the answer because they're the religious leaders, especially the scribes of all people. Then He said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? What's the answer? To do good. Ding, 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 ding. Tell them what they want, Johnny. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out, right? Or a religious scholar to figure that out. Jesus just asked them a simple question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil? They knew the answer was to do good. Now He continues the question. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to save a life or to kill? What's the answer? To save a life. To do good. It's lawful on the Sabbath to do good. It's like the story I heard of the young farm boy. He was on his tractor. They were baling hay, and all of a sudden the cart fell over in the back, the trailer. It fell over. And he was out there, and he was trying to lift the trailer up, couldn't do it. His farmer neighbor comes out, the farmer next door, and he says, hey, Johnny, come on over. Forget that. We'll pick that up later. I'll help you. Just come on in. We'll have dinner. Get you some strength, and we'll come, and I'll help you get that later. He says, no, I don't think Dad would like that very well. He said, oh, well, he'll be fine. He don't care if you go to have dinner with us. He's like, okay, but I don't think Dad will like it. So they go off to dinner, and they're eating a hearty dinner. After it's over, he says, I tell you what, he says, Johnny says, man, that was really good, but I still think Dad's going to be awful, man. He says, oh, he'll be fine. I'll go talk to him. Where's he at? He said, he's under the trailer. Well, see, even a Pharisee in that day would say, if your ox fell in or somebody fell into trouble or was hurting or was injured, you help them. Even the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees would agree to that. And so Jesus asked them, is it right to do good on the Sabbath or evil? To do good. Is it right to save a life or to kill? Now keep in mind, this is going to come into play here in a moment, so remember this. Verse 4, at the end of it, it says, but they kept silent. They didn't even answer the question, because they would indict themselves. And here's what Jesus does. He says in verse 5, and when he had looked around at them, he's waiting for them to answer the question. Now they were watching him, and now he's watching them. And he looks at them, and he looks around, and here's what he does. He says he looked around at them with what? Anger. He was angry at them. But that anger quickly, it says, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts. He was angry with them and then became grieved. It broke his heart that he knew their thoughts and their minds, their intents, and he knew the hardness of it. And he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. They're waiting. He brought him up here. He said, come here. They're waiting. Jesus is going to make his move. We've got him. As soon as he touches him, he breaks the Sabbath. And what Jesus do? Stretch out your hand. Isn't that awesome? Didn't touch him, didn't do anything. He just said, stretch out your hand. And so here you go. We don't know how long it's been that way, but all he did was, and it was as whole as the other. It was restored as whole as the other. Verse 6, then the Pharisees went out. They witnessed this. They witnessed this miracle. He brought them in the front so everybody could see. Verse 6, then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him how they might destroy him. We could say kill him. Is it lawful to save a life on the Sabbath or to kill it? They were plotting on the Sabbath to kill Jesus. It was Jesus' habit to go worship. There were several players here. They were here for different reasons. Jesus went to worship regardless of who was there. You know what? Jesus could have easily said, I'm not going to the synagogue because there's a lot of hypocrites there. There's some hypocrites there, right? You picked up on that? The Pharisees and the scribes? How many of you go to work every day? Do you realize there's hypocrites there? Right? When school's in session, how many of you go to school? There's hypocrites there, you know. How many of you go to the grocery store? Buy stuff? You know, you're in line with hypocrites. You don't stop going to other places. Why would you stop going? Why did Jesus wouldn't stop going? That's where he needs to be. Now I'm going to ask you a hard question. Jesus in the real world, do you realize that Christ was in the synagogue? He was there. God was there at worship. God is here right now. He's in our presence, in our midst. The two or more gathered together in my name, I'm there in the midst of them. Do you realize He's here? Let me ask you a question. Why are you here? Why are you here today? Are you here to stretch out your hand and receive a blessing? Or are you here just kind of looking around? Are you here just kind of, just testing the waters? You see, they missed this miracle. Can you imagine? Jesus brings the guy up here and he says, stretch out your hand. He stretches it out. It's just as good as the new one. And they leave, and how can we kill him? They missed the miracle that took place. I do not want you to miss what God has for you. If the band will come. I want to encourage you to, when you come together to worship, when you worship the living God, bring a bucket. Bring a bucket to draw from the living water, if you will. Some people bring a seine. You dip it in, and what happens? So it comes out. Maybe somebody bring a colander. I don't know. I call it a strainer. I'm not. Maybe some of you today need to stretch out your hand, if you will. Maybe you need to step forward. You know, that's what this altar time is for, is just to come together, just to almost like, kind of like every once in a while, a step of faith, just come out and say, Lord, I'm trusting you to meet me. So I'm going to come, and I'm just going to come, and I'm going to stand before everybody, and I'm going to just have somebody pray with me, or just pray here. Whatever you have, a need, or whatever, that's what this time is for. Maybe you just want to pray by yourself. That's okay. You don't have to come. You can make that step right there. But I'm just saying, some of us maybe need to step out. Some of us may need to literally stretch our hand to receive. Will you stand? Maybe you've never set Christ for salvation. I invite you to come here too. Make that decision today. As we
Wonders
just say the word. God, right now I speak the word to people's lives that need it. Whatever they're going on, whatever they're going through, Lord. And I just pray right now as we lead, that you encourage, direct, guide, lead us, Holy Spirit, present. Let's go out to this world and just let them see Jesus in us. Let us be real. Let us show them what it means to be a true